We're double checking something.
Okay.
Can you still see him?
Yes.
Yeah. You have to record both sides. No big deal. They can edit that out.
I'm going to get out of the way then.
Okay, guys are ready to go.
Okay. Who's first? Introduce yourself.
If you can squeeze in a little closer to each other, because the ones on the end are getting cut off a little bit. There we go.
Squeeze him back up.
Okay, I'm Carter. I'm Emily.
Me too.
I'm Jenna. And I'm Trista.
Hi.
Okay, so one of our first questions is, so some of our sources said that Howard Carter, he found broken jewelry in the tomb that he was in, and he gave it to his dentist as a gift. So do you think that this would be appropriate for what he found, or would he still be considered like a great archaeologist?
This is material that he supposedly found in King Tut's tomb or a different tomb?
In King Tut's tomb.
That's a story I don't remember reading myself. And I've read a lot of stories about Howard Carter, whole biographies of him, but it certainly wouldn't be appropriate to do today. You have to remember, we're talking 90 years ago, almost 100 years ago. Attitudes were very different then, and the laws were very different then about antiquities and protection of antiquities. For his time, Howard Carter was a very good and very professional archaeologist. But he was also, he was an interesting character. He had some personality quirks, whatever you want to call them, hang-ups, problems. He was not an easy man to get along with, and he went to anger very quickly with people that upset him. And he considered certain things that he did, if he had done the work and found things, he felt a certain type of proprietary interest in it, like it's his. And I don't think any archaeologist today would think this way, but again, they wouldn't think this way about a lot of things that have changed in the last 100 years. So I wouldn't say what he did was right, but it doesn't make him evil or bad necessarily, just maybe not always showing the best judgment.
And does the Milwaukee Public Museum have any artifacts directly from the tomb? And if so, do you know how you got them?
We actually have one object that has Tutankhamun's name on it. It's cartouche. I discovered this several years ago, about 25 or 30 years ago. I was looking at this when we were developing an earlier version of the new exhibit, Crossroads of Civilization, when we developed temples, tells, and tombs in the late 80s and early 90s. I came across this very small piece of clay that just had a stamped royal name in it, a cartouche. And it says Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, royal names had two names, the prenomen and the nomen. And his name was Neb-Keperu-Ra Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was his, what they call a birth name, the name he was given as a child. And Neb-Keperu-Ra was his throne name, the name he was given when he became king. Usually, in very formal depictions, you would put both names side by side, both cartouches. This particular small piece, which is just, as I say, a piece of clay that has the name stamped in it, was probably something to attach or to place on maybe a wine bottle, maybe some other commodity that just says it belongs to the king or the king's storehouses or whatever it happens to be. It's not easy to read, but the fascinating thing is that his name, Tutankhamun, is very rare in Egyptian history, or at least parts of it are rare. The syllable Tut or Tut, T-U-T, is not found in any other Egyptian royal name throughout history. So if you can find that part of the name even, just Tut, you know you've got Tutankhamun because there are no other kings with that syllable. I had that looked at by two different Egyptologists at different times from the University of Chicago, and I said, I think this says Tutankhamun. Do you want to look at it? And they both said, yes, it does seem to have his name on it. Now, this is something we received, I believe, back in the 60s, I believe from I can't remember if it was a dealer or something. It's almost certainly, I say almost certainly, I don't really know, probably not from his tomb, because there were things, as I say, that he would have storehouses and things when he was alive where jars of wine and who knows what would be stored with his name attached to them. It probably comes from something like that rather than an object that would have been found in his tomb.
Why do some people think Howard Carter was a thief and others think he was a hero?
Well, people love to get their own opinions, and they get very opinionated about these things. And these things, just like, as I said before, what he knew and his attitudes from 100 years ago were very different from they are today. Over the last 100 years, attitudes about Howard Carter have changed. At the time when I was young, when I was your age, which was a long time ago, I remember reading books as a youngster about Howard Carter and King Tut's tomb, and he was always portrayed as a very heroic, wonderful archaeologist, and he was. He was a very impressive archaeologist. He was very careful, very methodical. He took a great care in excavating that tomb, labeling everything, photographing everything before he moved, taking great care to conserve these objects before they were moved so they wouldn't fall apart. Some of the techniques they used were common then or were invented then for those objects are not maybe what we would do today, but that's because we've progressed technologically in how you would preserve certain things. But his basic approach of being very careful was an excellent one. It was not typical for his time in the 1920s. Many archaeologists, the one who was digging in the Valley of the Kings before Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon, a man named Theodore Davis, who owned or controlled the concession for the Valley of the Kings in the early part of the 20th century, before World War I, he excavated some very important tombs in the Valley of the Kings, about which today we know almost nothing, because almost no photographs were taken, no record was made of the objects that were taken out, or anything. Again, he was a product of his time, but he was far less careful than Howard Carter was. Some of the bad reaction about Howard Carter, I think, has come in more recent years, particularly since going into the tomb again, and not too long ago. You know, the mummy was CAT scanned just about 11 years ago, January of 2005. And Zahi Hawass, an Egyptian who was the head of the Antiquity Service at the time, saw the mummy for the first time, and he was appalled at the condition of the mummy. And so he started saying some not so nice things about how Howard Carter worked and how he treated the mummy in an attempt to find out about it. And yes, it's unfortunate that things like that were done, that the mummy was essentially dismembered because it was so fossilized, so stuck together with chemicals, that he literally had to cut it apart to even get at it. And today we would obviously try to be much, much, much more careful than that. But again, it's a changing attitudes about him. I was just reading something in a new book by Hawass where he actually is praising Howard Carter as an archaeologist and how careful he is. But then when he starts to talk about the treatment of the mummy, he gets a little negative again. So it all depends on what you're looking at, one aspect of his work that you're critiquing. But I would say in general, you have to remember that he was a product of his times. He's not a product of today. It's always easy to go back and say, well, look at what he did, and we certainly wouldn't do that today. Well, you know what we do today, 100 years from now, people will say, wow, why did they do that? What a bad idea that was. We'd be much more careful today because they'll have different technologies and different attitudes. So these kind of things always change. You always try to be better, but nobody's perfect, and you have to judge people in the context of the time they lived in.
So you would agree that it's unfair on some of these critiques of Howard Carter on how he's being judged, because they're judging him by today's standards.
Exactly. Now, as I said, he did have personality issues. He was a difficult person to deal with. He had a very superior sort of a chip on his shoulder attitude about some people and about some things. And so he was difficult to get along with at the time. And a different type of individual with a different personality might have reacted very differently to some of the situations. I mean, I know people today that I think, well, they could get along better with other people and then they wouldn't have so many roadblocks in their way. They put up their own roadblocks. Sometimes people are their own worst enemies just because of the nature of their personality. And I think Howard Carter had some of that. But he was a good archaeologist for his time, certainly.
Are there any descendants from King Tut's bloodline that are living today?
Boy, not that I know of. The last that we know of for sure, and I'm not even for sure, even some of the recent stuff that's been done on DNA with him and some of the other royal mummies is, to me, questionable because a lot of it has not been published in technical journals yet. It's still just been published in very popular books or in on documentaries on TV, which are not vetted or critiqued by scholars. So there are many scholars that question some of those results. It's like you can say such and such a thing, but if you don't prove it with the evidence, what good is saying it until someone else can assess the evidence? So you have that kind of thing. It's difficult to assess. Tutankhamun is so popular that there's almost something new about him literally every year. The exhibit we just did last year, we have, has any of you been to that, Crossroads of Civilization yet? You should get down and see it. We created a life-sized figure of Tutankhamun in his chariot, based on one of his chariots. There were 6 chariots in his tomb. And it's sort of the centerpiece of the exhibit. And we talk about him as sort of an icon of ancient history, a character that is so well known that everybody's heard of him and everybody thinks they know something about him. But in fact, what we know about him is very, very minimal. We know very, very little about him, despite his fantastic tomb and all the things that were found in it. These are mostly showy objects. There was no writing in the tomb. There's no history in the tomb. We didn't learn anything about his history, personal or the history of his times. As far as descendants of him, there were 2 fetuses, mummies, 2 little immaturely, not yet born mummies in the tomb that are assumed to be his children, but that's never been proven, of course, because it's difficult to prove. It's hard to find ancient DNA to begin with, but so that would have been the end of his bloodline right there if those, in fact, are his descendants, because they obviously didn't even live to be born, let alone to have children of their own. So as far as we know, that is the end of not only Tutankhamun's line, but the whole line of the 18th dynasty ended with him.
So how many museums do you know of have artifacts from the tomb?
Well, the vast majority, of course, are in the Cairo Museum. Theoretically, all of them should have been. They have years ago transferred several of the items down to the Luxor Museum, which is also in Egypt, which is closer to the Valley of the Kings, where his tomb is. So, but that's another Egyptian museum. There had been some items in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They had assisted Carter and Carnarvon when they excavated the tomb. They supplied the photographer and some other expertise. And as a result, they were given a few objects sort of secretly or clandestinely. Most of those objects have been returned to Egypt in recent years, probably all of them. There were a few items actually at Highclere Castle, which is Lord Carnarvon's castle in England. If you're familiar with the show Downton Abbey, that's filmed at Highclere Castle at Lord Carnarvon's home. And I visited there once back in the early 1990s, about 25 years ago, and they had a small museum down in the basement where they had a few objects from King Tut's tomb, but I believe those have also probably been returned to Cairo since then. So as far as I know, except for the odd little piece like that we have, this little clay piece, which, as I said, is probably not from the tomb. It dates to Tutankhamun's reign, but almost certainly not from his tomb. I don't know offhand of anything definite that's known about things in other museums outside of Egypt.
So, this isn't a question this is kind of going off what we were just talking about, but For the artifacts, are most of them, like, is Egypt trying to get them back, or are they just kind of holding off, letting other museums, like, have them?
Yeah. When Zahi Hawass was the Minister of Antiquities, which was up until from 2001 till 2011, when they had the Egyptian Revolution, he's been out of that position for about almost 6 years, almost 5 years now. He was very actively trying to get materials from Egypt returned to Egypt from various places. He was trying to get the Rosetta Stone back from the British Museum in London. He was trying to get the Nefertiti head that's in the Berlin Museum in Germany back to Egypt. To date, those major things have not been returned to Egypt. They're still in the countries that have held them for a long time. Egypt has enough political and economic problems right now that in the last 5 years there have been about 4 or 5 different ministers of antiquities after Zahi Hawass. They've had other issues to deal with besides just trying to reclaim objects, just trying to deal with joblessness in the program, loss of tourism, loss of economy for Egypt, political problems, terrorists all around them in countries all around them, Syria and Libya and whatnot. So that has not been their highest priority in very recent years.
Do you know of any other tombs that Howard Carter discovered?
Oh yes, he worked for a long time, for many years in Egypt before he was in the Valley of the Kings. He actually worked with Lord Carnarvon for several years before they even got permission to dig in the Valley of the Kings. The years leading up to World War I. I don't think that they found too many tombs, but he did find in his early career, he found one of the tombs of Hatshepsut, the queen who was a king, really, the female king they call her. She had 2 tombs, and he found one of them in about 1904. It was not a highly decorated tomb, so it doesn't get a lot of press today. It's not something you can visit if you go to Egypt, so people aren't as familiar with it, but that's one tomb, an important one that he found, certainly.
So, some of our sources that we read, it said that King Tut had a rushed burial. Why would this have happened?
Well, again, what people say and what they know are 2 different things. A lot of books about Tutankhamun say certain things because people who write them often have agendas of their own. They're trying to promote a certain point. And so they will take some evidence and say, this seems to suggest. I think the main reason they say it's a rushed burial is because his tomb is very small. It only has 4 small rooms. And yet it was cramped with material. I mean, 6 chariots. They were so big and space-consuming that they had to be cut up. The axles were cut in half, and then they were stacked, the wheels stacked on top of each other over in a corner. The shrines that surrounded his actual sarcophagus and mummy coffins were assembled. They were so big, they couldn't be assembled and brought into the tomb. They had to be taken in one wall at a time and then assembled inside the burial chamber because there wasn't enough room to bring them down into the tomb. They are marked with hieroglyphic marks that tell you this is the left side or this is the south side, this side up, or whatever, things like that. And they were found when they were dismantled by Howard Carter and his team that they were, some of them, assembled incorrectly. The wrong piece was put in the wrong place when they put them back together. These are suggestions of a rushed burial, a very small tomb that could be finished very quickly, and material that wasn't assembled properly to begin with. In fact, many people have an idea. There's another tomb very much like King Tut's tomb. The designs are very similar inside, but it's a much larger tomb. It's in a section of the Valley of the Kings that's called the West Valley, which is sort of a separate side branch of the Valley of the Kings. There's only 4 royal tombs in it. One of those is a tomb for a man named Ai, who actually was an old man who was the next king after Tutankhamun died, but he was not a direct relative. We think, or some people think, Ai, who had been the vizier of Egypt, sort of the prime minister, had married Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun. We don't know that for sure, but there are suggestions that that might have been the case. I was apparently buried in this bigger tomb, although the tomb, as I said, looks very much like Tutankhamun's, only larger. Now, what if that were the one being prepared for King Tut, and then when he died suddenly as a young man, he was less than 20 years old, we think, so presumably he died unexpectedly. Nobody knows exactly why he died, and there are more theories about how he died or was killed than you can count on two hands. If he died unexpectedly, which is normally the case when you're 19 years old and you're why would not I, who's going to take over as the next pharaoh, say, well, let's just get him out of the way. We'll bury him in this tomb they were starting for somebody else, or maybe for me even. This much smaller tomb, we'll bury him in here, and I'll take over this bigger tomb because I'm going to be the next king. So that's a popular theory too, but you can't prove it, but there's evidence to suggest it, certainly.
Carter, you're making our heads spin.
I know my answers aren't very short, are they?
No, this is, I'm saying that as a compliment. This is incredible stuff. Incredible stuff. Who's next?
Okay, so do you know how many expeditions Howard Carter went on after he discovered Tutankhamun's tomb?
He didn't go on any. They found Tutankhamun's tomb finally in 1922. He worked on it almost consistently for 10 years. There was a period in 1923-24 when the tomb was closed and he was locked out. There was a big problem with the Egyptian government. But otherwise, he worked on it consistently for 10 years. In 1932, he finally finished working on King Tut's tomb and had cleared everything out. And then he was in his late 50s then. He wasn't an old man, but he was middle-aged. For whatever reasons, he seems to have lost interest in the tomb. He never published anything more about it. He never worked on any Egyptian digs again, as far as I know. He lived until 1939, so he lived another 7 years after he finished King Tut's tomb. He eventually died of cancer in his mid-60s. But he was not healthy the last few years of his life. He had this cancer, this lymphoma, and spent most of his time in England, not in Egypt at all, and sort of dropped off the map of archaeology after that.
Why does King Tut get so much ink?
Well, because I think it started obviously way back in the 1920s when his tomb was found, because here's an unlooted tomb, essentially an unlooted tomb, with all this gold and all this magnificent stuff. So that's what made the initial headlines. It was all about what's in the tomb. Then, of course, there was a problem with all the press trying to cover it. So Lord Carnarvon, who actually had the control of the dig, Howard Carter was the archaeologist, but Lord Carnarvon was the one who was in charge because it was his money that was being spent. That's just how the system worked in those days. He was the one who barred all other journalists except for the London Times from coming and reporting, because he didn't want all these journalists mucking up the works every day and bothering all the archaeologists, keeping them from getting any work done. So he gave the Times an exclusive contract to cover all the finds. This irritated all of the other newspaper reporters, including Egyptian newspaper reporters, who couldn't get the news until after the London Times had published it. So they were in a bad mood. They weren't happy with Carter and Carnarvon. And unfortunately, it wasn't Carter who made this rule. It was Carnarvon, but as I'm sure you know, Carnarvon died 5 months after the tomb was discovered. So Carter was the one that was left to deal with all this background, I guess, and all these problems. This meant that they would come up with stories, and they came up with stories about the curse of King Tut, one of them in particular. And it helped that Lord Carnarvon died after just a few months, because that was the first proof of the curse, you know. There was no curse. There was no curse found in that tomb. Everybody dies. Whether you've been in King Tut's tomb or haven't been in King Tut's tomb, you're all going to die. I'm going to die. Everybody's going to die. So to say people who went into King Tut's tomb died, well, what are they going to live forever? It's just a sort of a goofy point of view. But it grabbed the imagination. It actually, believe it or not, the curse of King Tut, as much as it did not really exist, but it made a good story, was ultimately what led to the first famous movie with Boris Karloff in 1932, The Mummy. And all the more recent movies about mummies coming back to life, if you open their tomb, including the more recent ones with Brendan Fraser 10 or 12 years ago. And there's a new one coming out this year, actually, called The Mummy Again, a remake. This whole idea stems from The Curse of King Tut's Tomb, a made-up story. So that's one thing that has given it legs and has lasted the interest in it over the years. There's been the whole issue of more recent researches on it. Today, the story is, the big story this year is that inside King Tut's tomb, there's a British Egyptologist again, a man named Nicholas Reeves, who has proposed that inside that tomb is actually a false wall, the burial chamber wall, the painted wall that you always see in the pictures. Behind that wall is a bigger part of the tomb, an earlier part of the tomb that actually he thinks was built for Nefertiti, possibly the mother or stepmother of Tutankhamun. Now, they've done some radar to test all this, and they think maybe there is something back there. The question is, are they ever going to actually go in to look for it? I don't know. The point is, Tut has become this magic word, King Tut. And did he have a curse? He had all this great gold in his tomb. So it just, things keep feeding into it. Every year there's different stories. As I say, in 2013, there was a story based on DNA analysis that said that King Tut might have, and the mummy itself, King Tut might have been killed in a chariot accident. The wounds that are on his body might have been caused by him being run over by a chariot. Well, the very next year, 2014, somebody else published a report that said, oh no, he had a club foot. It was a genetic problem that he was born with. He couldn't possibly have been into a chariot, let alone driven around in a chariot. So one group is saying he died from a chariot fall, and another group is saying he could never have ridden in a chariot in his lifetime. These are totally opposite points of view. But as long as people keep putting them out there, they get their name in the paper, they get papers done, they get books done, they get documentaries on TV, so it helps their reputation. It keeps it going. And obviously the public is fascinated with this.
Which leads us to the question of what is Howard Carter's legacy? Why is he important? Why should we?
Well,
how should we remember him?
Yeah, he's important for the reason of finding King Tut's tomb and bringing, as I say, a definite sense of rigor and methodology to excavating the tomb. He could have excavated it much more like Theodore Davis a few years before had excavated the tombs, and we'd have far less information than we have today, because the problem with archaeology is once you dig something, it's destroyed, more or less. You can't put the tomb back together again once you take it apart. All you've got are the photographs, the drawings, the notes you made about what it looked like. Unfortunately, we have tons of that for King Tut's tomb. For other royal tombs that were found just a few years before, 10 or 12 years before, we have none of that. And today we're still arguing over what mummy is in that tomb. Oh, well, here was this coffin, but what did it say? I don't know. It was never photographed in situ. We aren't even sure what position it had in the tomb. So he's important for that specific reason. But he's important also because at that time, this raised such a furor, it sort of redefined how antiquities in Egypt are dealt with. Up to that time of the finding of that tomb, the law said if an excavator finds something, they get 50% of what they find, and the Egyptian government gets 50%. But it also said, unless it's an undiscovered royal tomb, an unlooted royal tomb. Well, the Egyptians argued that King Tut's tomb was an unlooted royal tomb, and essentially it was unlooted, but it actually had been broken into in antiquity, and a couple of very minor thefts had been done from it by tomb robbers. Carter and Carnarvon argued, therefore, it was not an unlooted tomb, it was a looted tomb, and therefore they should get 50% of what was in it. This created a lot of controversy, and it has helped define, not just for Egypt, but for many, many countries that have antiquities, modern laws about how finds are divided and how much. And fortunately, it's also, despite all the hype about all the gold objects and things, it is refocused on what archaeologists does today. It isn't about finding objects. It's about information. It's about finding knowledge. We found very little knowledge from King Tut's tomb. If you look at it from the pure point of view of what did we learn historically about the Egypt of his time, we learned almost nothing about it that we didn't already know, which was very little. So that's why there's so much speculation and so much guesswork and so many new ideas and theories coming out all the time because there's so little that is known. I always say Tutankhamun is one of those characters. There's enough known about him to make him interesting, but enough not known about him to allow people the freedom to speculate in a lot of different directions, and nobody can disprove them frequently.
Wow. How many questions you girls have left?
I have one more.
Okay. Last question.
Okay.
Some believe that Howard Carter improved the science of archaeology. What is your opinion?
Well, I think he definitely did. As I said, his rigor and his methodology set standards that were followed from that point on, I think, by most people. No, he's lucky because when he was very young, he went to Egypt to do archaeology when he was 17, not much older than you girls. He started working right away within 1 year with a man named Flinders Petrie, who is sometimes called the father of Egyptology or the father of modern archaeology. Flinders Petrie was an Englishman who had gone to Egypt in the early 1880s. And he developed the modern scientific recording of archaeological materials. And because Howard Carter worked with him as a very young man in the 1890s, he learned that attitude about archaeology, about keeping good records, photographing, documenting, drawing everything. But King Tut's tomb was the one that really hit the newspapers and hit we didn't have TV then, obviously, but there were even newsreels made about him that were shown in the movie theaters, silent films about the excavation of King Tut's tomb. So his was the first dig that got enough attention that the general public started to see archaeology in a different way, that it's a much more scientific and careful approach to recording history than what had been done before, not just a treasure hunt like we think of with Indiana Jones. So he's very important that way.
Carter, you have been incredibly generous with your time.
I've enjoyed it.
This was mind-blowing. This is awesome.
Great. I hope you all become archaeologists. I know that won't happen, but if even one of you become an archaeologist, that's something,
That's great. Hey, continued success with your work, and I think we're going to get these girls down there and see the.
Oh, definitely do it. It's a great experience. If you do find you're coming down, let me know, and if I've got time, I'll come stop down and see you.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great day. Good luck with the report.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carter.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.